Welcome to DriverDTrains. Thanks for stopping by. I'm your host, DriverD. Our conductor and brakeman, Scratchy-C, is anxious to get this train rolling. In December 2024, DCC-EX announced the release of the EX-CSB1 Express, an all-in-one plug-and-play command station and booster. This marked a major milestone in the evolution of DCC-EX from an Arduino-based project to a product that runs on a variety of modern microcontrollers, including members of the ESP32 family of microcontrollers and the STM32 Nucleo series of microcontrollers. The EX-CSB1 is a remarkable technological achievement, offering a 5-amp command station and booster in a package the size of a deck of playing cards, which can control both DCC and DC locomotives at the same time. And with an initial price of just $120, the EX-CSB1 was an incredible value and a fraction of the price of any other commercial DCC system. Unfortunately, at the time of the making of this video in June 2025, the EX-CSB1 is currently unavailable in the US as the DCC-EX hardware store has temporarily closed until the tariff situation changes. However, some model railroaders might prefer a more affordable DIY alternative to the EX-CSB1's all-in-one plug-and-play package, and an option that includes more digital input and output pins to control accessories, sensors, and turnouts. Now that DCC-EX officially supports a number of different 32-bit microcontrollers, we have several alternatives to choose from in addition to the classic Arduino, and we can assemble a DCC-EX command station using one of these options for a fraction of the cost of the EX-CSB1. In this video, we'll wrap up the series on DCC-EX in 2025 by looking at two such DIY alternatives to the EX-CSB1. An ESP32-based solution using what is commonly referred to as an ESPDuino board that looks like an Arduino Uno, and an STM32 Nucleo board that features a unique double row of connector pins for both Arduino Uno-style shields as well as its own set of morpho pins for digital I/O connections. DCC-EX currently supports each of these boards, and each is compatible with both the standard Arduino motor shield or its clones, as well as the EX Motor Shield 8874. And we can configure these boards using either the Arduino IDE or the EX installer. Be sure to check this video's description for links to my other videos, as well as the various websites and products I mention here. Also, if you are enjoying the videos, please leave a comment and hit the like button. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Stay alert, because today's run is a hotshot. DIY alternatives to the DCC-EX EX-CSB1. Let's wrap up this series on DCC-EX in 2025 by looking at two DIY alternatives to the EX-CSB1 DCC-EX command station. This video is not for complete novices to the DCC-EX system. For this discussion, I will assume that you are already somewhat familiar with how to assemble and configure a DCC-EX command station using an Arduino or a compatible clone. If not, please see my video series number 4 on how to assemble and configure a DCC-EX command station. In fact, I highly recommend that you first assemble an Arduino-based DCC-EX command station and learn how DCC-EX works before moving on to these other DIY alternatives. The DCC-EX developers have 10 years of experience ironing out the kinks running DCC-EX on the Arduino, and as we will see, they are still navigating through some of the idiosyncrasies of these other boards. Plus, we can reuse many of the parts from our Arduino-based DCC-EX command station when we assemble a new command station using an ESP32 or STM Nucleo board. I will also refer you to some of the previous videos in this series on how to configure a DCC-EX command station, including video number 8B, Configure DCC-EX EX-CSB1 with EX installer, and video number 8C, configure DCC-EX, EX-CSB1 with Arduino IDE. All of those lessons will be applicable to the boards we look at today, not just the EX-CSB1. Here are the stops on today's itinerary. First, we'll look at how to assemble an ESP32-based DCC-EX command station using an ESPDuino WeMos board, and then install and configure DCC-EX on the ESP32. Then we'll do the same thing for an STM Nucleo board. Notch up the throttle because we're highballing out. DIY alternatives to the DCC-EX, EX-CSB1. Part 1. The ESPDuino WeMos D1 R32. The first option we will look at today is an ESP32 development board, commonly referred to as an ESPDuino, or sometimes a WeMos D1 R32. These boards and their various clones use an ESP-Room32 microcontroller with built-in Wi-Fi mounted on a board that looks like an Arduino Uno. In fact, the Room32 is the original version of the Room32E chip that DCC-EX is using on the EX-CSB1. And because the board has the same form factor as the Arduino Uno, we can easily attach an Arduino motor shield on top of the board to control our trains. We can find various copies and clones of these boards on Amazon and other merchant websites for less than $10, but be sure to check the delivery options as some of them are shipping from overseas. The original ESPDuino versions had a USB Type-B connector on them, similar to the Arduino, while the WeMos versions have a micro USB connector. I purchased a board on Amazon in 2024 from HiLetGo and received a WeMos branded board. The other hardware item that we will need is a compatible motor shield. We can use either an Arduino R3 motor shield or a compatible clone, or an EX motor shield 8874. If you would like more information about the motor shields, please see my prior video number 4A, Assemble a DCC-EX Command Station. For this video, I will use the same Deke Robot Kabuk motor shield clone that I used in that video. We can find these on Amazon for about $15. Assemble an ESP32 DCC-EX command station. Once that we have the ESP32 board and the motor shield, we can assemble the command station. We'll start by mounting the motor shield onto the ESPDuino WeMos controller board. However, we need to make some slight modifications to the motor shield first, by bending 4 of the header pins on one side of the board. As I mentioned in video number 4A, the voltage we need on the motor shield to run our trains could damage the controller, so we need to prevent that voltage from reaching the controller. In that prior video, I cut a small trace on the backside of the board to do that, but in this video we're going to bend the header pin that carries that track voltage. This is the pin that is marked VIN on one end of the header with 8 pins. We just need to bend it enough so that it won't go into the header socket on the controller board. I like to bend the pins inwards so that I won't accidentally touch them later. In addition to the VIN pin, we also need to bend the A0 and A1 pins in the 6-pin analog pin header. We need to bend these because DCC-EX uses these pins for current sensing, but the ESP32 uses those circuits for its Wi-Fi. The A0 and A1 pins are the pins just across the gap between the headers, closest to the VIN pin we just bent. Finally, we need to bend the I/O ref pin, which is the second to last pin on the header with the 8 pins that also has the VIN pin. The ESPDuino WeMos controller boards send 5 volts through this pin, but the motor shield returns that voltage back to the controller via the analog pins, which would fry the ESP32 microcontroller, which runs on 3.3 volts. Once we have bent the 4 pins, we can carefully insert the rest of the pins into the header sockets on the controller board and gently press the motor shield into place. The bent pins will cause the motor shield to ride a little higher on that side, but that is okay. Just make sure the motor shield is snug in its sockets. Now we need to install 3 short jumper wires and a resistor into the header sockets on top of the motor shield. We can make our own jumper wires by cutting a short length of 22 gauge solid core wire about 1 inch or 25 millimeters long, and then stripping off about 3/8 of an inch or 9 millimeters from each end. Next, we'll bend the stripped wire into a square U shape. Then we place the stripped wires into the appropriate pin sockets on the header as follows. One jumper will go from the socket for the A0 pin we bent on the analog header to the socket above the A2 pin on the same header, while another will go from the socket above the A1 pin we bent to the socket for the A3 pin. We can bend the jumper wires a little bit side to side so that their insulated parts sit flush next to each other. Be sure there is no exposed bare metal wire touching. The last jumper wire will go from the socket above the I/O ref pin we bent on the 8-pin header to the socket for the 3.3 volt pin 2 spots over. This will help ensure that we don't fry the ESP32. Lastly, we need to install a small 200 to 300 ohm resistor between the socket for the 3.3 volt pin, where we just put one end of the third jumper, to the socket above the I/O0 pin at the end of the header. We can get a package of 100 suitable resistors on Amazon for about $5.50. Keep the other 99 for spares. We need to add the resistor because there is a defect in these ESPDuino WeMos boards that prevents the Wi-Fi from working reliably unless we do this. In my own testing, I was able to use the Wi-Fi somewhat in access point mode, but could not use it at all in station mode until I added the resistor. As with the jumper wires we made, we will want to cut the resistor to about 1 inch or 25 millimeters long, with the resistor itself in the middle, and then bend it into a square U shape. One end will go into the same 3.3 volt socket as the last jumper wire. It may help to take the jumper wire back out of the socket and put the resistor in first, or put them in together. The other end will go into the socket above the I/O0 pin at the end of the header. Again, we can make sure the two items are snug flush against each other, but make sure that no bare metal wires are touching that shouldn't be. We have now completed the basic assembly of the ESP32 controller board and the Arduino motor shield clone. Note that if we want to use an EX motor shield 8874 with the ESP32 controller instead of an Arduino-style motor shield, we will need to follow a different set of steps to prepare the motor shield. We can find those instructions on the DCC-EX website, and I'll include a link in this video's description. In addition to the ESP32 board and the motor shield, we will also need a suitable power supply, USB cable, and wiring to power our DCC-EX command station and connect it to the tracks on our layout. Again, see my video number 4A for detailed information and instructions on the necessary parts and how to assemble them. Also, see my video short on using ferrules with stranded wire to make the connections easier. We don't need to add a separate Wi-Fi shield to the ESP32 command station because the ESP32 already includes built-in Wi-Fi. However, we can attach one or more OLED displays to the I2C pins on the motor shield the way that I described in the two previous videos in this series. Number 8E, add a second display to our DCC-EX command station, and number 8F, add a display to DCC-EX using an I2C multiplexer. Now that we have assembled the ESP32 command station hardware, we are ready to install and configure DCC-EX. Install and configure DCC-EX on the ESP32 command station. We are now ready to install and configure DCC-EX EX command station on our ESP32 controller board. Fortunately, for those who have been following along with this series, we configured DCC-EX on the ESP32 exactly the same way that we did on the EX-CSB1 in earlier videos. We can use either the DCC-EX EX installer or the Arduino IDE. I am not going to repeat all the steps for installing EX installer and the Arduino IDE in this video. Please see video number 8B, Configure DCC-EX EX-CSB1 with EX installer, and video number 8C, Configure DCC-EX EX-CSB1 with Arduino IDE for detailed instructions on how to install and use those tools. For the purpose of this video, there are only a few settings that we need to change to configure EX command station on our ESP32 controller board. We'll look at EX installer first. Using EX-Installer. After we connect our ESP32 controller board to our computer using an appropriate USB cable, we'll start EX-Installer and make sure that Expressive ESP32 is enabled in the Enable Extra Platforms box. Then we'll forward to the Select Your Device screen. We'll click the radio button for the USB port our ESP32 is connected to. If we're not sure which port that is, we can unplug the USB cable, press Refresh Device List, and see which port disappears. Then plug the cable back in and refresh again to see the port that shows up. Then, in the drop-down menu for that port, we'll select ESP32 Dev Kit as the device. We then proceed to select EX Command Station as the product to install, and decide whether to create a new configuration or use an existing configuration that includes our EX-Rail automations and our myhal.cpp sketch. After that, we select all the options for our command station's configuration, including its display settings, Wi-Fi, and other options. The most important thing we need to select is the type of motor shield or motor driver. For this video, we'll select Standard Motor Shield, but if we were using the EX Motor Shield 8874, we would select that option instead. If we select the Advanced Config option, then we will have a chance to review the config.h file that EX-Installer makes for us. It can be handy to keep a copy of this information for future reference. Then we can compile and then load the EX Command Station software to our ESP32 microcontroller. When the code is done loading, the command station will reboot, and we can verify that DCC-EX is running correctly in the device monitor window. Using the Arduino IDE. If we would like to make additional edits to the EX Command Station code, we can use the Arduino IDE to install the software on our ESP32. We do this in the exact same way that we did in video number 8C. All the steps are the same. We need to add the URL for the ESP32 board packages in the Setting Preferences window, make sure that version 2.0.17 of the ESP32 board package is installed, select the USB port the ESP32 controller board is connected to, and make sure the upload speed and serial monitor baud rate are both set to 115200. We then need to copy or create a config.h file. We can use the config.example.h file as a template, or copy the config.h file the EX-Installer created. We'll want to make sure that the motor shield type is set to Standard Motor Shield or EX8874 Shield if we are using the EX Motor Shield 8874. We configure the settings for our Wi-Fi and display the same way we would on any DCC-EX command station. We don't need to tell EX Command Station that we are using an ESP32. It will figure that out by itself. We then upload the code to the command station just as before by using the round button in the upper left corner of the IDE window. That's all there is to it. We have now assembled an ESP32-based DCC-EX command station for less than $50 and are ready to run some trains. Grab some iron because we're a ball of fire. Part 2. The STM Nucleo-64 F446RE. The second alternative we will look at today is assembling a DCC-EX command station using an STM32 Nucleo board from ST Microelectronics. ST, or ST Micro, is a large European multinational semiconductor manufacturing and design company. Ironically, one of the companies that eventually merged to form ST Micro was the Italian semiconductor company SGS, founded by Adriano Olivetti in the 1950s. As I described in my video number 4X, DCC-EX series bonus materials, the Olivetti company was one of the co-founders of the Interaction Design Institute Ivrea, where the Arduino project was first conceived 20 years ago in 2005. Now we'll look at using an STM32-bit microcontroller to use in place of the 8-bit ATmega microcontroller in the Arduino. The specific board that we will use is the STM Nucleo-64 F446RE. This is one of several STM boards that DCC-EX supports. Like other Nucleo boards, it features a set of header pin sockets that are compatible with Arduino-style shields, which means that we can easily mount an Arduino motor shield to the board. The Nucleo-64 and the larger Nucleo-144 boards also feature a second set of header pins called morpho pins that allow for additional I/O connections to the board. As a result, the board offers a lot of physical connectivity options. Also, the digital pins on the board are 5-volt tolerant, which means that we can use many of our 5-volt Arduino accessories with them, including sensors and I2C devices. Note, however, that the analog pins are not 5-volt tolerant and are limited to a maximum of 3.3 volts. The STM Nucleo-64 boards also don't need any hardware modifications to use, unlike the ESPDuino that we looked at earlier. Also, when we update the code to the boards, it generally uploads much faster than on the ESP32. However, there are some downsides or drawbacks to the STM Nucleo. For starters, the boards cost about $20 more than the ESP32 boards we looked at, or about $30 for the F446RE. Also, the STM Nucleo-64 boards don't include built-in Wi-Fi, which means we will have to add a Wi-Fi shield to the board, the same that we did with our Arduino-based command station in video number 4C, adding a Wi-Fi shield to our DCC-EX command station. Unfortunately, the Wi-Fi shield with the correct firmware for DCC-EX is currently unavailable in the US because the DCC-EX hardware store is temporarily closed. However, we can order the correct version direct from the manufacturer MakerFabs, as well as some other online retailers, although it may take a bit longer to arrive. Nevertheless, this will add an additional $10 plus delivery fees to the cost of our command station. And the assembled command station will be larger in physical size than the ESP32 command station. Finally, before we use the STM Nucleo, Windows users will need to install a device driver, and we should update the board's USB firmware. Assemble an STM Nucleo DCC-EX command station. For this video, we will pair the STM Nucleo board with an EX motor shield 8874. This motor shield provides higher current to the track than the standard Arduino motor shield and served as the inspiration for the EX-CSB1. The EX motor shield 8874 also features a regulated power supply so that we can safely power the Nucleo board from our track power supply if we choose, and we don't need to make any modifications to the board to use it. We could use an Arduino R3 motor shield, but the Nucleo F446RE is only rated for a maximum of 12 volts on the VIN pin and really prefers 7, so we would need to power the Nucleo separately if we want to run our trains using a power supply with more than about 9 volts. Again, the EX motor shield 8874 is currently unavailable in the US, but we can order one from the manufacturer Semify in Austria or another international retailer. The Nucleo F446RE includes a jumper on the board that we can use to select whether it uses the USB connector or the VIN connection to the motor shield as its power source. We will need to set the jumper to the USB connection in order to program the board, but once that is done, we can set the jumper to power the Nucleo from the EX motor shield 8874 instead if we like. We'll start our assembly by pressing the motor shield's pins into the Arduino header sockets on the Nucleo board. As always, we'll want to make sure that everything is lined up and all the pins are going into the sockets. We'll also need to be careful not to stab ourselves with or otherwise damage the morpho pins. Long term, we will want to have something to place the Nucleo board on so that we don't short out any of those pins. Next, we'll add the Wi-Fi shield to the top of the motor shield. We'll need to remove or relocate the jumpers on the transmit and receive pins on the top of the Wi-Fi shield. Again, see my video number 4C if you would like more detailed information. We'll use 2 female-to-female jumper wires to connect the Wi-Fi shield to 2 of the morpho pins on the Nucleo board. We can start by pressing one end of each jumper wire onto a pair of the transmit and receive pins on the Wi-Fi shield. We can then wrap the wires under the board to keep them out of the way. We'll connect the other ends to the Nucleo in a moment. Now we attach the Wi-Fi shield to the motor shield. Again, we'll want to make sure that everything is lined up and all the pins are in the correct sockets. Next, we'll attach the 2 jumper wires from the Wi-Fi shield to the first 2 morpho pins. These are the pins closest to the barrel connector for the power supply on the motor shield. The wire from the receive pin on the Wi-Fi shield will attach to the number 1 pin closest to the edge of the Nucleo board, while the wire from the transmit pin on the Wi-Fi shield will attach to the number 2 pin next to the number 1 pin. We can then attach our I2C devices to the I2C pins on the motor shield in the standard fashion. Note that although I2C on the Nucleo is 5-volt tolerant, the EX motor shield 8874 only supplies 3.3 volts to its VCC pin. Therefore, if we want to use a 5-volt accessory such as an LCD display, we will want to get the 5 volts VCC directly from the Nucleo. We can get this from Morpho pin number 18. To find this pin, we'll count 7 pins back from the Wi-Fi transmit wire we attached to the number 2 pin, then connect the VCC to the 8th pin. There will be 7 unused pins between the number 2 pin and the number 18 pin when we are done. We have now assembled a DCC-EX command station using an STM Nucleo board. Once we add a power supply and prepare some track feeder wires, we will be done with the basic hardware setup. Now we are ready to install and configure DCC-EX. Install and configure DCC-EX on the STM Nucleo command station. In order to install DCC-EX on our STM Nucleo, we first need to connect it to our computer. Unlike the Arduino or the ESP32, the STM Nucleo mounts on our computer just like an external drive. On a Mac, we don't need to do anything, and the F446RE will simply show up on our desktop with a drive icon. On Windows, however, we will need to install a driver before we can connect the Nucleo to our computer. We can download the driver directly from DCC-EX using a link on their website. I'll include the link in this video's description. This will download a zip file to our computer. After the computer completes the download, we'll need to extract all the contents of the zip file. This will create an STMicro Nucleo drivers folder on our computer. Then we navigate in the Nucleo drivers folder to the folder that ends in 009 and find the batch file called ST-Link-Win-USB install. We'll right-click on this file and select Run as Administrator from the pop-up menu. This will launch the device driver installation wizard. If it asks whether we want to allow it to make changes, we need to say yes. We'll click Next and then Install. When it's done, we'll click Finish. We can now connect the STM Nucleo to our computer with a USB cable. Unfortunately, the F446RE uses a USB mini connector, which is that awkward size that was popular 10 years ago for about 5 minutes before it got replaced by micro USB. We'll need to provide our own cable, so hopefully you have one somewhere in a drawer. When we connect the Nucleo to our computer, we will either see its icon appear on our desktop on a Mac or see a notification that it is mounted on our Windows computer. Next, we will update the firmware for the Nucleo's USB serial communications controller. While not absolutely essential, updating the firmware will eliminate a bug that sometimes causes the USB serial connection to fail when using JMRI or the EX Web Throttle app with our DCC-EX command station. We can find the firmware update in the Nucleo drivers folder in the 007 folder. Inside this, we'll open another 007 folder and then the Windows folder. We then launch the ST-Link Upgrade application. In the application, we'll click the Device Connect button and our computer will connect to the Nucleo. Once it does, we'll see the current firmware version on the screen. We can click the Yes button to update the firmware. After a minute or so, we should see a message that says, Upgrade is successful. We can close out of the firmware updater. There is also a Java app for Mac and Linux users to update the firmware, but it requires an Intel x86 version of the Java runtime environment. And while it is possible to run the x86 JRE on an M-Series Mac, frankly, it doesn't seem to be worth the trouble. I'll leave a link to another video on YouTube that explains how to do it, if anyone is a glutton for that particular kind of punishment. We can now install the DCC-EX EX command station software on the STM Nucleo. As with the ESP32 command station we looked at earlier, we can use either the EX installer or the Arduino IDE to install EX command station on the STM Nucleo-64 F446RE. Using EX installer. In the EX installer, we'll make sure that the ST Microelectronics Nucleo STM32 slider is checked in the Enable Extra Platforms box on the Manage the Arduino CLI screen. After that, using EX installer is exactly the same as we have already done. The only difference is that we choose the option for the ST Microelectronics Nucleo F446RE from the drop-down menu on the Select Your Device screen, and then select the appropriate display and motor driver on the configuration screen. So for this video, we'll select a 20x4 LCD display and the EX-8874 shield for the motor driver. After that, we upload like before, and we're done. Using the Arduino IDE. We can also use the Arduino IDE to upload DCC-EX EX command station to the STM Nucleo. First, we need to add a URL to the Additional Boards Manager URLs box in the Settings Preferences window, the same way that we added a URL for the ESP32 in video number 8C. We can obtain the URL from the DCC-EX website, and I will include it in this video's description. Once we add the URL in the Settings Preferences window, we can use the Arduino Boards Manager to add version 2.7.1 of the STM32 board package to the Arduino. We need to make sure that we choose version 2.7.1 and not a newer version. Then we select the USB port that the Nucleo is connected to, enter Nucleo in the board's search box, and select Nucleo-64 from the listed options. Then we need to go to the Tools menu and scroll down to where it says Board Part Number. This will open a flyout menu to the side where we can select our F446RE board number. Finally, we can make sure that the USB speed in the Tools menu is set to Low Full and confirm that the baud rate in the serial monitor is set to 115/200 baud. As before, we make sure that the motor driver, Wi-Fi, and display settings in our config.h file are accurate. Because we're using the EX Motor Shield 8874 for this video, we'll set the motor shield type to EX-8874 Shield. Then we compile and upload the code. We have now assembled and configured a DCC-EX command station based on an STM32 Nucleo board and an EX Motor Shield 8874 as a second alternative to the EX-CSB1. All aboard! What's next? Wrapping up the series and assembling a WiTController. This video wraps up the series on DCC-EX in 2025. During the series, we looked at the new EX-CSB1 Express all-in-one plug-and-play command station and booster. We learned how to use the EX installer and the Arduino IDE to configure our DCC-EX command station and add new functions to the command station using the myhal.cpp sketch. We learned how to customize the display of our command station, added a second display to the command station, and then learned how to add more displays using I2C multiplexers. Finally, we looked at two DIY alternatives to the EX-CSB1. In my next video, we'll look at how to assemble a WiTController to use with DCC-EX to control our trains. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos, and check this video's description for links to my other videos, including my video series on assembling a DCC-EX command station and my series on using JMRI's Decoder Pro app to control our trains. The year is half over, but that means the second half is just beginning. There are places to go and things to see, so hop on board and let's find out together what lies on the tracks ahead. Until then, thanks for watching. Scratchy, why were you in such a hurry today? You had to be somewhere. Where did you have to be? All aboard!